In the sweltering heat of August 1777, deep within the dense, dark wilderness of northern New York, a proud European army was slowly bleeding to death. It was not dying from a grand artillery bombardment, nor from the crushing assault of an imperial fleet, but from trees, mud, hunger, and a growing phantom force of angry local farmers. Lieutenant General John Burgoyne had boasted in the polished parlors of London that with 8,000 disciplined troops, he could march straight through the American colonies from Canada to Florida, cutting the rebellion in two and bringing the king's unruly subjects to their knees. Burgoyne was a master of grand aristocratic pageantry, a seasoned veteran of European battlefields, and a favorite of King George III. But as his long column dragged itself south toward Albany, Burgoyne was discovering that the North American frontier played by an entirely different set of rules. His horses were dying of exhaustion and disease in the suffocating summer humidity. His soldiers were reduced to half rations of moldy flour and rancid salt pork. His supply lines stretched over 100 miles back across Lake Champlain to Quebec, exposed, fragile, and constantly harried by colonial guerrillas. To save his grand invasion from grinding to a complete halt, Burgoyne desperately needed fresh horses, draft oxen, beef cattle, and thousands of pounds of flour. He was informed by loyalist informants that just 40 miles to the east, nestled at the foot of the Green Mountains in a tiny frontier hamlet called Bennington, the American rebels had established a massive regional supply depot. It was guarded, he was told, by nothing more than a disorganized mob of local militia, plowboys and backwoodsmen who would scatter like sheep at the first glimpse of a royal bayonet. Burgoyne ordered a strike force of elite German heavy cavalry, British regulars, and loyalist auxiliaries to march into the hills and seize the depot. It was supposed to be a quick, easy foraging raid, a minor logistical errand that would restock his army's cupboards and intimidate the countryside into submission. Instead, it became one of the most unexpected and devastating disasters in British military history. On a muddy hilltop overlooking the Walloomsic River, those raw, unrefined farmers did not run. Led by an illiterate, crusty, 64-year-old veteran named John Stark, a man who hated the Continental Congress almost as much as he hated King George, the American militia delivered a crushing defeat to the British Crown. In a single afternoon, a collection of woodcutters, blacksmiths, and country squires destroyed 10% of Burgoyne's entire army. It was the crucial domino that shattered the British Northern Campaign, setting the stage for the historic surrender at Saratoga and forever altering the destiny of the American Revolution. To understand how a gathering of simple New England farmers managed to break the vanguard of an empire, one must go back to the early spring of 1777, when the British military high command in London devised what they believed was the definitive strategy to end the American Revolutionary War. For 2 long years, the conflict had dragged on without a decisive conclusion. General George Washington's Continental Army had survived the brutal winter retreats across New Jersey, proving that the rebellion could not be easily snuffed out in a single campaign. British strategists realized that New England was the emotional, ideological, and logistical engine of the entire colonial uprising. It was New England that had birthed the Sons of Liberty, staged the Boston Tea Party, stood its ground on Lexington Green, and inflicted staggering casualties on British regulars at Bunker Hill. If King George's generals could physically isolate New England from the rest of the 13 colonies, the rebellion would be deprived of its primary source of manpower and zeal, causing the American cause to collapse from within. The strategic plan was elegant on paper. Burgoyne proposed a sweeping, 3-pronged invasion that would slice through New York like a trifold blade. Burgoyne himself would lead the main British army south from Quebec, sailing down the pristine waters of Lake Champlain and Lake George before marching overland to the Hudson River and driving down to Albany. Simultaneously, a secondary British column under Lieutenant Colonel Barry Street Leger would push east through the Mohawk Valley from Lake Ontario. Meanwhile, the main British army in North America, under General Sir William Howe, was expected to thrust north up the Hudson River from New York City. All three forces would rendezvous at Albany, establishing an unbroken line of heavily fortified British garrisons along the Hudson River corridor. New England would be completely severed from the middle and southern colonies, trapped inside an inescapable military vice. Burgoyne initiated his march in June 1777 with supreme confidence. His army was a magnificent war machine, numbering nearly 8,000 battle-tested men. Roughly half were elite British regulars, perfectly drilled and impeccably equipped. The other half were German mercenaries hired from the European principalities of Brunswick and Hesse-Kassel. These German soldiers, known universally as Hessians, were hardened professionals trained in the iron discipline of European warfare. Accompanying this grand military parade were dozens of heavy brass cannons, hundreds of baggage wagons, and an extensive train of civilian camp followers, officers' wives, and servants. At first, Burgoyne's advance seemed totally unstoppable. In early July, his army swept down Lake Champlain and laid siege to Fort Ticonderoga, the legendary American stronghold known as the Gibraltar of the North. The American garrison at Ticonderoga, commanded by General Arthur Street Clare, was stunned when British engineers miraculously hauled heavy cannons up the steep, jagged cliffs of Mount Defiance, a high peak overlooking the fort that American engineers had deemed completely inaccessible. Realizing that the British guns could rain red-hot iron down onto his wooden ramparts, St. Clair ordered a secret, chaotic night evacuation, abandoning vast stores of artillery, gunpowder, and provisions. When news of Ticonderoga's sudden fall reached King George III in London, the monarch reportedly burst into his wife's chambers, bursting with excitement, declaring that he had beaten all the Americans. Across the Atlantic, shock waves of sheer terror rippled through the American colonies. It appeared that nothing on the continent could stop Burgoyne's massive army from tearing through the heart of the newborn republic. But as Burgoyne pushed south from Ticonderoga into the deep wilderness beyond the lake, his easy victory began to transform into a grueling, demoralizing struggle. The geography of the North American interior was entirely foreign to European officers, accustomed to manicured fields, stone roads, and open countryside. Here, there were no paved roads or established supply centers. There was only an endless, primeval forest, choked with impenetrable underbrush, treacherous bogs, and roaring mountain rivers. Making matters immeasurably worse was the brilliant, relentless scorched earth strategy deployed by the retreating American commander in the region, Major General Philip Schuyler. Schuyler understood that he could not face Burgoyne's artillery and disciplined bayonets in an open field battle. Instead, he turned the land itself into a weapon. As Schuyler's small force fell back toward Albany, hundreds of American axemen worked around the clock, felling thousands of giant oak, pine, and hemlock trees across the narrow wilderness trails, creating massive, tangled barricades that blocked every road. They dug deep trenches to divert creeks, transforming firm forest paths into waist-deep quagmires of liquid mud. They burned every wooden bridge, destroyed every flour mill, torched standing crops, drove off cattle and horses, and poisoned freshwater wells. Burgoyne's grand army ground to an agonizing crawl. To move a single artillery piece or supply wagon forward, his soldiers had to spend hours hacking through massive logs and building makeshift timber bridges across flooded creeks. In some stretches of the wilderness, the army managed to cover less than 1 single mile in 24 hours. The brutal heat of the northern summer brought stifling humidity and cloud-like swarms of biting black flies and mosquitoes that tormented the men and horses endlessly. Worse still, Burgoyne's logistical supply chain was fracturing under its own immense weight. To maintain the luxurious standards of an 18th-century European army, Burgoyne insisted on carrying an absurd amount of personal baggage, including his own extensive wine collection, heavy silver dining sets, and full-dress uniforms, alongside 30 massive artillery pieces. Feeding 8,000 soldiers, civilian workers, and horses in the middle of a destroyed wilderness required an unending stream of supply wagons coming all the way from Canada. But those wagons required draft horses and oxen, and those animals were dying by the dozens every single day from exhaustion, heat stroke, and a total lack of forage. By early August, Burgoyne had managed to reach the Hudson River near Fort Edward, but his invasion was on the verge of collapsing from sheer starvation. His men were living on severely reduced rations of moldy flour and salt pork. His cavalry regiment, the Brunswick Dragoons, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum, did not even possess horses. These German cavalrymen were forced to trudge on foot through the knee-deep American mud, while wearing heavy, stiff leather riding boots that weighed over 12 pounds per pair. Long, heavy broadswords that dragged on the ground, and thick woolen coats totally unsuited for the sweltering climate. Burgoyne desperately needed horses to mount his dragoons, draft animals to haul his heavy cannons, and live cattle to feed his starving troops. It was at this moment of crisis that Loyalist officers in Burgoyne's camp stepped forward with an alluring, disastrous proposition. Loyalist guides assured Burgoyne that just 30 to 40 miles to the east, located in the rolling hills of the New Hampshire Grants, sat the small town of Bennington. Bennington was serving as a central logistical warehouse for the American rebel forces in the region. Its stone barns and storehouses were reportedly overflowing with hundreds of horses, draft oxen, barrels of wheat, herds of cattle, and military equipment. Furthermore, the Loyalists insisted that the surrounding countryside was populated largely by secret Loyalists who were eager to declare their allegiance to the crown the moment royal troops arrived to protect them. They assured Burgoyne that the rebel force guarding the Bennington depot was nothing more than an unorganized, cowardly group of local militia who would instantly drop their weapons and scatter into the woods at the first sight of British uniforms. Burgoyne was completely blinded by these optimistic, wildly inaccurate reports. Desperate to solve his logistical nightmare, he ordered Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum to lead a strike force eastward into the New Hampshire Grants to seize the Bennington supply depot. Baum's written orders were incredibly broad. He was instructed to march through the countryside, capture all usable horses for the Brunswick Dragoons, seize at least 1,300 draft horses for the main army's supply wagons, drive herds of cattle back to the Hudson, levy taxes on the local towns, and test the political sympathies of the population. However, Baum was perhaps the single worst choice of commander for such an expedition. He was a stern, rigid German officer who spoke not a single word of English. He had no understanding of American culture, no experience fighting in dense wilderness, and no knowledge of the unorthodox hit-and-run tactics favored by colonial insurgents. His command consisted of a diverse, fragmented force of roughly 650 men, 200 of his unmounted Brunswick Dragoons, a small detachment of British infantry, a company of Loyalist militia, a contingent of French-Canadian volunteers, and a band of around 100 Native American warriors, primarily Mohawks and Abenakis, who served as scouts and advance skirmishers. On August 11, 1777, Baum's column stepped off from the British camp on the Hudson and began its march eastward toward Bennington. As they wound their way through the narrow forest valleys, Baum's Native American auxiliaries ranged ahead, burning isolated farmhouses, slaughtering cattle they could not drive away, and plundering local homesteads. Rather than terrifying the local populace into submission, these destructive actions ignited a roaring fire of vengeance across the New England frontier. Express riders rode through the night, carrying word to every farm, hamlet, and village across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. The redcoats and their foreign mercenaries were invading their homes, bringing fire, murder, and destruction to their doorsteps. The farmers of the backcountry reached for their long hunting rifles resting above their stone fireplaces. But to transform an enraged mob of independent farmers into a cohesive, deadly fighting force, they needed a commander who understood both the brutal realities of frontier war and the fierce, uncompromising spirit of the New England woodsman. They found that leader in John Stark. John Stark was a towering legend in the Granite Hills of New Hampshire. 64 years old, weathered, sharp-tongued, and fiercely stubborn, Stark was a man forged in the crucible of the northern wilderness. Decades earlier, during the French and Indian War, he had served as a senior captain in the famous Rogers Rangers, mastering the arts of wilderness survival, forest combat, and ambush warfare. He had once been captured by an Abenaki raiding party, earned their deep admiration by refusing to submit to their physical hazing, and was eventually adopted into their tribe before being ransomed back to his people. When the Revolutionary War erupted in 1775, Stark immediately raised a regiment of New Hampshire militia and rushed to Boston. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, Stark's legendary cool-headedness saved the nascent American army from complete destruction. Positioned on the extreme left flank along the Mystic River, Stark noticed an unprotected beach where elite British light infantry were attempting to flank the American earthworks. Stark personally led his men to construct a stone barricade down to the water's edge, walked out in front of his line, pounded a wooden stake into the sand, and ordered his men not to fire a single shot until the advancing British redcoats stepped past that mark. The resulting volley destroyed the advancing British column, holding the flank and allowing the Continental Army to make an orderly retreat. Stark went on to fight with immense distinction at Trenton and Princeton, crossing the icy Delaware River alongside George Washington. But despite his heroic record, Stark possessed an unyielding temper and an utter hatred for political maneuvering. In early 1777, when the Continental Congress bypassed him and promoted politically connected junior officers over his head, Stark felt his personal honor had been deeply insulted. Disgusted by political favoritism, he resigned his commission in the Continental Army, hung up his sword, and returned to his farm in Derryfield, New Hampshire. When news of Ticonderoga's fall and Burgoyne's advance reached the New Hampshire legislature, panic gripped the entire state. Desperate to raise a force to defend their western border, the General Assembly turned to the one man everyone knew would fight. They offered John Stark a commission as a brigadier general in the state militia and begged him to take command. Stark agreed, but on one extraordinary, unprecedented condition. He would answer strictly and solely to the New Hampshire legislature, and not to the Continental Congress, nor to any Continental Army general in the region. He flatly refused to let politicians in Philadelphia or Continental officers like Philip Schuyler tell him how to defend his homeland. The legislature accepted his terms without hesitation. The moment news spread that old John Stark was taking the field, a wave of electric enthusiasm swept across the New Hampshire countryside. Men and boys dropped their plows, grabbed their powder horns, and rushed to enlist. Within less than a week, nearly 1,500 volunteers assembled at Exeter and Charlestown. These were not polished soldiers in uniform. They were ordinary, rough-hewn farmers, woodcutters, blacksmiths, and country boys. They wore their everyday linen shirts, homespun wool trousers, and slouch hats. They brought their own long hunting rifles, smooth-bore fowling pieces, and leather shot pouches. Stark marched his growing militia force across the steep, rain-soaked Green Mountains, arriving at Bennington on August 9th. There, he joined forces with Colonel Seth Warner and the remnant of the Green Mountain Boys, a legendary militia unit that had been defending Vermont's independence for years. Stark was also joined by local militia units from Berkshire County, Massachusetts, including a fiery local minister named Reverend Thomas Allen, who had brought his entire church congregation to fight, declaring that if the militia did not fight the invaders now, he would never preach another sermon to them again. John Stark now had nearly 2,000 battle-ready militiamen gathered around Bennington. He was ready to lure Baum into a fatal trap. As Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum pushed his German column closer to Bennington, the easy foraging expedition he had been promised began to violently dissolve. On August 14th, near the small settlement of Scorched, Baum's advance guards skirmished with a small detachment of American militia who were in the process of destroying a wooden bridge. To Baum's surprise, the Americans did not run in terror. Instead, they delivered a sharp, well-aimed volley before vanishing into the thick timber. Baum began to realize that the Loyalist reports of timid rebels and welcoming populations were utterly false. As he pushed forward along the Walloomsic River, just 4 miles west of Bennington, across the New York border, he found himself staring at an ever-thickening wall of American riflemen hovering in the surrounding woods. Realizing that he was severely outnumbered and deep in hostile territory, Baum halted his advance on a steep, heavily wooded hill overlooking the river and the main road to Bennington. He immediately dispatched an express rider on horseback back to Burgoyne, urgently requesting reinforcements. Burgoyne, finally recognizing that Baum was in grave danger, ordered Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Breymann to lead a second column of 600 Brunswick heavy infantry and 2 heavy brass cannons to Baum's relief. But Breymann's relief force moved at a painfully slow speed. The dirt roads had been transformed into deep rivers of mud, and Breymann was a rigid Prussian-style officer who refused to break formation, stopping his column repeatedly to dress his ranks and clear his heavy guns from the mire. It would take Breymann nearly 2 full days to march just 24 miles. Meanwhile, on the hill above the Walloomsic River, Baum ordered his men to construct defensive earthworks. But Baum's tactical plan was fatally flawed. Instead of concentrating his 600 men into a single, tightly defended fort, Baum scattered hessian force across several isolated positions spread out over a wide area. On the highest peak, which would become known as the Hessian Redoubt, Baum placed his core force of 200 Brunswick dragoons, supported by a single brass cannon and a few British regulars. Down near the Walloomsic River Bridge, he built a small wooden breastwork manned by French-Canadian volunteers and German infantry. Further off, on a lower hill across the river, Baum positioned his Loyalist militia inside an earthen fortification known as the Tory Redoubt. His Native American scouts were camped in the thick forest between these scattered outposts. On the night of August 14th, dark, furious storm clouds rolled over the Green Mountains, unleashing a torrential rainstorm that battered the region throughout the entire day of August 15th. The downpour turned the forest floor into a swamp and rendered black powder firearms almost useless. Both armies remained pinned in place, thoroughly soaked. Inside the German redoubts, the soldiers wrapped greased rags around the locks of their muskets to keep their powder dry. Across the valley, John Stark spent the rainy hours carefully scouting Baum's positions. Stark instantly recognized Baum's fatal blunder. The German redoubts were completely isolated from one another and could not provide mutual supporting fire. Stark devised a bold, brilliant plan. Rather than launching a direct, frontal assault against dug-in troops, a maneuver that had cost so many lives at Bunker Hill, Stark decided to execute a double envelopment, surrounding Baum's scattered hilltop positions on all sides simultaneously. By the morning of Saturday, August 16, 1777, the heavy storm clouds finally parted, revealing a hot, brilliant summer sun that quickly baked the soaked fields into a steamy, humid haze. The ground was drying rapidly, and John Stark knew that he had to strike before Breymann's relief column could arrive to reinforce Baum. Stark split his force with tactical precision. He sent Colonel Nicholas Nichols with 200 men on a long, circuitous march through the dense woods to the north to get directly behind Baum's main redoubt on the high hill. He dispatched Colonel Benjamin Simons with another column around to the south to envelop the Tory redoubt on the far side of the river. A third column was ordered to move against the bridge in the center. Stark himself retained the main body of nearly 1,000 militiamen in the valley directly in front of Baum's Hill, serving as a loud, visible distraction. Because the American militia wore no military uniforms, they moved through the thick forest in their ordinary, everyday clothes: homespun coats, linen shirts, and wide-brimmed farm hats. To tell friend from foe in the chaotic battle to come, Stark had his men tuck small slips of white paper into their hatbands. This lack of uniforms caused a bizarre and fatal misunderstanding inside the German lines. Baum had been repeatedly assured by loyalist guides that hundreds of local Tories would be coming out of the hills to join his army. As Nichols's and Simons's militia columns emerged from the forest on the flanks of the German positions, Baum's lookouts assumed these men, dressed in plain farm clothing, were loyalist recruits arriving to aid them. Baum actually issued strict orders to his gunners not to open fire on the approaching farmers. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the American flanking columns had maneuvered completely into position, quietly surrounding the hilltop redoubts. Down in the valley, John Stark mounted his horse, drew his sword, and pointed it dramatically toward the British and German positions on the heights. He turned to his men and delivered one of the most famous, iconic battle cries in American military history. "There are your enemies, the Redcoats and the Tories. They are ours, or this night Molly Stark sleeps a widow." A second later, a sharp, single crack of rifle fire echoed from the woods behind the Hessian hill. Nichols' flanking column had reached its position and opened fire. It was the prearranged signal for the general attack. Instantly, the peaceful Vermont forest exploded into a terrifying, continuous roar of musketry and rifle fire. From every tree, rock, log, and fence rail surrounding the hill, thick clouds of white smoke erupted as hundreds of American farmers opened fire on the trapped German garrison. Stark later described the opening moments of the battle as one continuous clap of thunder. The Native American warriors camped in the forest behind the hill, realizing instantly that they were caught in a deadly, inescapable ambush, let out piercing war cries, and scrambled through a narrow gap in the American line, fleeing into the deep woods and leaving Baum to his fate. The Loyalist militia holding the Tory redoubt on the lower hill were hit by a devastating crossfire from Simon's Massachusetts and Vermont militia. The battle at the Tory redoubt was horrifically intimate and brutal. Neighbors were firing directly at neighbors. Men who had known each other since childhood found themselves staring down the barrels of rifles across the wooden breastworks. Within 20 minutes, the Tory redoubt was completely overwhelmed. The surviving Loyalists broke ranks and fled down the steep hill toward the river, pursued by enraged American farmers wielding clubbed muskets, hatchets, and hunting knives. With the outer positions completely destroyed, the full weight of the battle shifted to the high hill, the main Hessian redoubt, where Friedrich Baum and his Brunswick dragoons made their heroic final stand. The Brunswickers were seasoned military professionals, and despite being totally surrounded, they fought with stubborn, incredible bravery. Standing shoulder to shoulder inside their earthen breastworks, the heavy dragoons poured disciplined volleys of musket fire down the steep, brush-covered slopes. Their single brass cannon thundered repeatedly, spraying lethal canister shot into the woods. But the American militia possessed a decisive weapon that transformed the battle: the American long rifle. While the German and British troops were armed with smoothbore muskets, which were wild and inaccurate beyond 70 yards, many of the New England frontier farmers carried long-barreled hunting rifles with spiral grooves inside the barrel. From behind trees and fallen timber, well beyond the effective range of the German muskets, American marksmen systematically picked off the German artillery crews and officers, one by one. For nearly 2 hours, the hilltop was consumed by a swirling storm of fire, smoke, and screaming men. The heat was suffocating. Sweat, mud, and black powder grime covered the faces of the combatants as the thunder of battle shook the Walloomsic Valley. Stark's militia pressed closer and closer, crawling up the steep wooded slopes under cover of the timber, tightening the deadly ring around the Hessian redoubt. Then, at the absolute climax of the battle, disaster struck inside the German position. A stray American bullet, or flying spark, landed directly inside the main German ammunition wagon parked behind the breastworks. With a blinding flash and a deafening roar that shook the earth, the powder wagon exploded in a massive fireball. Plumes of thick black smoke and burning wood debris launched high into the air. The blast killed dozens of defenders instantly and destroyed the last remaining supply of German gunpowder. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the hilltop as the smoke cleared. The German dragoons were completely out of ammunition. Their cannon was wrecked, their powder gone, and most of their officers were dead or wounded. Yet Friedrich Baum refused to surrender. Drawing his massive, heavy steel cavalry broadsword, Baum rallied his surviving men. He ordered his dragoons to draw their swords, sling their empty muskets over their shoulders, and follow him in a desperate, wild charge to hack their way through the American lines down the hill. The heavy dragoons surged over their ruined breastworks, swinging their massive broadswords with lethal strength. But against hundreds of loaded American rifles, a broadsword charge down an open hill was pure suicide. As the Germans plunged down the slope, the American militia delivered a shattering volley at point-blank range. Baum fell mortally wounded, struck down by a bullet through his abdomen. Seeing their brave commander fall, the surviving Brunswick dragoons broke their ranks, threw their swords into the dirt, and surrendered. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the main Hessian redoubt was captured. The hilltop was covered in fallen soldiers, shattered timber, and smoking debris. The American militia began rounding up hundreds of German and British prisoners, gathering captured muskets, and celebrating what appeared to be an absolute, historic victory. The Battle of Bennington seemed to be completely over. But just as John Stark's exhausted men were scattering across the battlefield to search for fresh water, tend to their wounded, and secure their captured spoils, a new, deadly threat appeared on the western horizon that threatened to turn their brilliant triumph into a horrific disaster. Unbeknownst to the victorious Americans, Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Breymann's relief column had finally arrived on the field. After trudging agonizingly through the mud for 2 full days, Breymann reached the outskirts of the battlefield at around 4:30 in the afternoon. There, he encountered panicked Loyalist refugees fleeing from the fallen redoubts, who informed him that Baum's force had been completely annihilated. Breymann did not turn back. Instead, he deployed his 600 fresh, impeccably trained Brunswick infantrymen into battle formation, flanked by 2 brass field guns loaded with canister shot, and ordered an immediate advance. As Breymann's column rolled down the road toward the Volumsic River, they caught the American militia completely unprepared. The scene on the battlefield was sheer chaos. Stark's men were scattered everywhere across the hills and valleys. Many militia officers were trying to secure hundreds of enemy prisoners. Others were rounding up loose horses or searching the captured enemy camp for food and equipment. Tactical units had completely dissolved. Suddenly, the roar of Breymann's 2 brass cannons shattered the late afternoon air. Iron canister shot tore through the trees, ripping through disorganized groups of American farmers. Breymann's infantry formed a wall of bristling bayonets and began advancing steadily across the open fields, delivering controlled, rhythmic volleys of musket fire. The American militia was pushed back in utter confusion. Exhausted from hours of hand-to-hand fighting, low on ammunition, and caught without a defensive line, the farmers began to fall back. Small groups of militia began retreating up the road toward Bennington. John Stark rode frantically through the turmoil, shouting at his men to stand fast, trying desperately to construct a new defensive line along a stone wall and a timber line. But Breymann's fresh German troops kept advancing, their drumbeats echoing off the surrounding mountains, their bayonets glistening in the setting sun. It was the ultimate nightmare scenario for a militia force, facing a fresh, highly disciplined army of European regulars in the open field when your own men were tired, scattered, and nearly out of powder. Victory was slipping away, threatening to turn into a total disaster. Then, just as the American line was on the very brink of collapsing, a dark cloud of dust rose from the road leading directly from Bennington. Out of the dust emerged Colonel Seth Warner and the fresh main body of the Green Mountain Boys, nearly 300 well-equipped, disciplined Vermont militiamen who had been stationed at Manchester and had completed a grueling march through the mud to reach the battlefield. Warner's men did not panic. They deployed into battle line with practiced, flawless speed, marching directly through Stark's retreating men to confront Breymann's advancing Germans. "Stand fast, boys!" Warner shouted above the din of battle. "We'll give them battle yet!" With Warner's fresh troops anchoring the center of the line, John Stark managed to rally his scattered militia on the flanks. The battle erupted for a second time with ferocious, terrifying intensity along the Volumsic Road. The second phase of the Battle of Bennington was a bloody, desperate duel fought at point-blank range in the gathering twilight. For over an hour, the two forces traded punishing volleys across the open fields and fence lines. Breymann's German infantry fought with incredible discipline, but they were operating under a crushing physical disadvantage. Their heavy woolen coats and thick equipment were suffocating them in the humid evening heat, while the lighter American militia moved fluidly through the timber, using trees and stone walls for cover. Furthermore, the sharp rifle fire from Warner's Green Mountain Boys began to decimate the German artillery crews. As the sun began to dip below the western mountains, Breymann's cannons fell silent, their ammunition completely exhausted. Realizing his guns were dead and seeing his men falling in droves, Breymann checked his ammunition supply. To his horror, he discovered his soldiers were down to their last few paper cartridges. On the American side, Stark and Warner saw the German fire begin to slacken. Sensing that the enemy was at the breaking point, Stark ordered a final, decisive general charge along the entire line. "Charge them, boys!" Stark roared. With wild, echoing screams, the American militia surged out of the woods and over the stone walls, rushing the German lines with clubbed rifles, hunting knives, and captured bayonets. The sight of hundreds of furious, screaming farmers charging out of the dimming light was too much for the exhausted German soldiers to bear. Their disciplined ranks shattered. Breymann, who had been wounded twice in the legs, realized total destruction was at hand and ordered an immediate retreat. The retreat instantly degenerated into a frantic, panicked rout. The German soldiers threw away their heavy muskets, backpacks, and heavy broadswords, running for their lives into the darkening forest toward the west. Breymann's 2 precious brass cannons were left standing abandoned in the middle of the road. Stark's militia pursued the fleeing enemy through the woods until complete darkness made further chase impossible. As night settled over the Walloomsic Valley, the gunfire finally ceased, replaced by the quiet groans of the wounded and the rustle of the night wind through the trees. The victory was absolute, complete, and stunning. When the morning sun rose on Sunday, August 17th, the true magnitude of the American victory at Bennington became clear to the astonished country. In a single afternoon, a force composed almost entirely of ragtag local militia had destroyed 2 complete detachments of royal troops. The British and German losses were catastrophic. Over 200 enemy soldiers lay dead on the field, including Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum, who succumbed to his abdominal wound in a nearby farmhouse shortly after the battle. More than 700 British, German, Loyalist, and French-Canadian troops were taken prisoner, including over 30 senior officers. In addition to the massive haul of prisoners, the American militia captured a treasure trove of military hardware. 4 heavy brass field cannons, hundreds of muskets, broadswords, brass drums, baggage wagons, and dozens of horses. American casualties were astonishingly light, just 30 men killed and 40 wounded. When news of the catastrophe at Bennington reached General John Burgoyne at his camp on the Hudson River, it struck the British command like an artillery shell. Burgoyne's entire strategic campaign collapsed in a single moment. Instead of securing horses for his cavalry and cattle to feed his starving troops, Burgoyne had lost nearly 1,000 veteran soldiers, roughly 10% of his entire invasion army. The defeat completely shattered the morale of his remaining Loyalist supporters and caused his Native American scouts to abandon his army en masse, leaving Burgoyne totally blind in the dense American woods. In a somber, private letter written to London shortly after the battle, a thoroughly humbled Burgoyne wrote, "The Hampshire Grants, a country unpeopled and almost unknown in the last war, now abounds in the most active and rebellious race on the continent, and hangs like a heavy cloud upon my left." The victory at Bennington sent a shockwave of electric joy and renewed confidence across the American colonies. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that colonial militia, when led by courageous and competent commanders, could meet elite European regulars in battle and utterly destroy them. Volunteers began flooding into the American camp near Saratoga by the thousands, transforming the Continental Army into a massive, unstoppable force. Deprived of provisions, isolated in a hostile wilderness, and stripped of his scouts, Burgoyne was forced to march blindly into a trap. Just 2 months later, in October 1777, Burgoyne's starving, exhausted army was completely surrounded at Saratoga by American forces under General Horatio Gates and forced to surrender his entire remaining command. The surrender at Saratoga was the ultimate turning point of the American Revolutionary War. It finally convinced King Louis XVI of France that the American Republic was capable of winning its independence, prompting France to enter the war as an official military ally, supplying the ships, troops, and gold that would eventually secure victory at Yorktown. And it all began on that muddy hilltop near Bennington, where a gathering of angry farmers took up their hunting rifles to defend their homes, their families, and their land. John Stark returned to New Hampshire as a celebrated national hero. Decades later, in 1809, at the age of 81, failing health prevented the old general from attending a grand anniversary reunion of the Battle of Bennington. He sent a written toast to his surviving comrades in arms, closing his letter with an immortal phrase that captured the unyielding spirit of the men who had fought alongside him on that steamy August afternoon. Live free or die. Death is not the worst of evils. Those powerful words eventually became the official state motto of New Hampshire, standing as an enduring, timeless reminder of the day an army of simple farmers broke the vanguard of an empire and reshaped the destiny of a nation.